I'm sure Clive had as much input as, Joy had as much input as Clive. So my first experience with Clive was when I stumbled upon a small book called the Toronto Bird Finding Guide. Clive was a contributor to this guide. So was George Peck, so was George Fairfield, Ron Tasker, Gerry Bennett, Ott Devitt, there were lots of others. Clive Goodwin later published 2 editions of the Bird Finding Guide to the Toronto region. So having become hooked on bird watching, that's what it was called at one time, my friends and I spent a lot of time in the Humber Marshes, Sunnyside, Toronto Island, Boyd Park. I grew up in Toronto and I thought I knew the place, especially the West End, very well. But Clive showed me that there were lots of places I was walking right by all the time, and they were full of birds. So later I found out about Gerry Bennett, started subscribing to Bird Finding in Canada. I still have a complete set of it. A lot of people in this room do as well. One issue in Bird Finding in Canada was a field trip to Niagara Falls advertised. At that time, it never occurred to me that Niagara Falls could be a good birding spot. So I was on a bus. We went on the bus, and Clive and Joy were there, and I met another guy, Arnold Daw. He spent a lot of time with me on that bus trip. He showed me how to identify hawks at 100 kilometers an hour, and he showed me how to, he was amazing. He showed me the difference between the way red-tailed sit and rough-leg sit, and I couldn't believe this guy. He was amazing. So I don't know why he was on this trip with a bunch of beginners. Turns out he was great birding buddies with Clive Goodwin. So I concluded, well, Clive Goodwin must be a pretty good guy to be hanging around Arnold Daw. So that day when we went to Niagara Falls, we saw birders everywhere we went. They all told Clive where the birds were, and that was my first introduction to the grapevine. And then I realized there were a lot of bird watchers out there, and they were really good. And it was a treat to meet some of them. Sometime later, I had a car. But then I knew that Clive had published a book entitled Bird Finding Guide to Ontario. And this book, in its 2nd edition, opened up Ontario for me. And there's been a copy of this book in every vehicle I've ever owned. There was one strange item in the Bird Finding Guide to Ontario, and that was sewage lagoons. I was a city boy and I just didn't get the concept. The looks people gave me when I asked them where the sewage lagoons were really amazing. So I don't know too many people that enjoy sewage lagoons, but once you've seen a curlew sandpiper or an avocet in a sewage lagoon, it makes it a little easier to ignore the aroma. So Clive had really started something. There may have been some birders who visited sewage lagoons, but he really expanded those numbers. So I became one of many with a dog-eared, bookmarked, note-filled copy of Clive in my vehicle. When Glenn and I went to see Clive in the spring to give him the award, he seemed quite flattered to see a beat-up copy. He knew that it was well used. And in closing, I'd just like to say there was another pioneering author who once was known for the author who got birders traveling all over North America with his field guide in their pockets. I'd just like to think that in Ontario, Clive was also present in their cars. So thank you. You're going to hear from Glenn now.
I'm still walking on air at the thought that I still qualify as a young birder. I'm going to just give you a sort of rundown on some of them. There are criteria for receiving this award, and I think Clive manages to pretty much tick off all of them. So for those of you, particularly some of the younger birders who don't know Clive, or have never met him, and also for the people who've known him for decades, you'll start to see the very impressive sort of body of work Clive has done in birding and field ornithology for going on now 65 years in Canada. When we went to see Clive in April, he gave me a sort of breakdown on some of the early times in his birding. He told me he started birding in Leeds, England at the age of 5. And that when he was in grammar school, Cattleford Grammar School in the village of Garforth, typical Clive started very early. He started a birding society for which he won a Rotary Club award. After the war, he immigrated to Canada with his family, settling in Toronto in 1949. And by the early 50s, he was already connected to all the best birders in Toronto. Like Gerry was saying, in the 60s, when they started, before we had the internet, when they first started doing bird finding bulletins and when they did this first Toronto bird finding guide, Clive was one of the many contributors of the information for these booklets. Those who used to read Jim Bailey's column in the Toronto Telegram, he did hundreds and hundreds of those columns. Clive was a constant contributor of information for those columns. I mean, for the young birders, it must seem insane that birdwatchers waited for Wednesdays and Saturdays Globe and Mail to come out to find out what had been seen that week. But that's the era we were in then. So Clive started out fairly early in terms of being involved in sort of the nuts and bolts of birding and field ornithology in Ontario. By 1957, he was already the editor of the Ontario Field Biologist, which he did for 3 years. From 1956 to 1964, he was the executive committee member of the Toronto Ornithological Club. From 1965 to 1977, he changed jobs. He had been working for General Electric. He changed jobs, and from 65 to 77, he worked as executive director of the Conservation Council of Ontario, which is like the umbrella group for all the conservation groups throughout Ontario, FON, all your local natural history clubs. It's an umbrella even over top the FON. Clive, by the late 1960s, had become both the vice president and the president of the Toronto Field Naturalists from 1968 to 1972. For 15 years, he coordinated the Lake Ontario Midwinter Waterfowl Inventory, which when he took it over from Arnold Daw, as Gerry was talking about, just included the Greater Toronto area. Clive expanded that out to be a waterfowl count that did the whole Canadian shore of Lake Ontario, from the east right to Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I coordinate that today. He passed it off to Bill Edmonds and Bill Edmonds to me, and that's an unbroken string since Clive did it out to the whole lake. It's going to be a very powerful data set. He was the editor of the Ontario Naturalist, the magazine of the Federation of Ontario Naturalists from 1962 to 1965. He wrote their worth noting bird column for 20 years, from 1960 to 1982. He was later an elective board member of the FON from 1962 to 1966. And he led FON trips for many years for the FON throughout the 1970s. Before he and his wife Joy went and sort of did that freelance. They taught birding courses out of their home and for many different organizations, at least 8 or 9 that Clive listed in Toronto. And then they freelance, took people on trips all over the world. So to Cuba, to Australia, New Zealand. And Clive had many clients who would just follow him wherever he was going. He was editor for Ontario for North American Birds for 18 calendar years, from 1965 to 1982. I don't think even Jim Bailey didn't hold that position for that long. Anyone who's even doing it for one of the 4 seasons knows how arduous it is to do one of those reports. Well, Clive was doing 4 for years on end. Clive, in doing that and many of the other things he did, realized Ontario needed some kind of structure as to how to deal with vagrant birds. Jim Bailey had died in 1970. He had sort of done it informally through the ROM. And with the loss of Jim Bailey, there was nobody taking that mantle up. So once again, Clive filled the breach there, and he started up the Ontario Ornithological Records Committee, This was the precursor to the current OBRC. He was on that committee from 1970 until 1981, before the committee became the OBRC, as you know it, and as it's run until today. Clive has maintained continuous participation in Christmas bird counts in both Toronto and Cobourg since 1950. As Gerry said, he's had the 4 major publications he did and like Gerry said, along with Joy. Because I mean, if you've ever tried to do a bird finding guide, you'll know that it's arduous. I mean, you got to drive all those roads, measure the distances, try to figure out what birds are there. It's a lot of work. So his first edition of the Bird Finding Guide to the Toronto region came out in 1979, and then he did a second edition in 1988. He did this small edition. I can't tell you how the big smile came on Clive's face when he saw a copy of this beat up at a Gerry's truck. Nothing guys like better than seeing a field guide this beat up. I brought Roger Troy Peterson one to sign one time with the cover dangling off by threads, and it was like better than giving him money. So yeah, Clive did that first edition in 1982, and then he updated it in 1995, the much larger edition that we all know. So that's through to 1995, and some of Clive's best contributions are still to come. Clive was instrumental in getting together all the records in Cobourg when he moved to Cobourg in the early 1990s. He pulled together all the records published and unpublished from Northumberland County and put them into a database and produced a virtual book, which is a website on the birds of Northumberland County. And being forward-thinking, he got people to collaborate with, and this database is now approaching 400,000 records. So it was no small task, and he has collaborated with others to make sure that all those records make it into eBird as well. So this was a major, major accomplishment. He was also a member of the Management Steering Committee of the first Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas from 1980 to 1985. By 2000 to 2005 in the second Breeding Bird Atlas, he was a member of the local organizing committee for Northumberland County itself. He also independently wrote for their Chamber of Commerce a bird finding guide to Cobourg. Seems wherever Clive goes to live, it needs a bird finding guide. We're not the first ones to honor Clive. As far back as 1976, the FON gave him their Distinguished Public Service Award. In 1977, he was honored with an honorary life membership by the Conservation Council of Ontario. In 2009, he was given the Doris Spears Award for outstanding contributions to Canadian ornithology. And in 2010, his local club, the Willow Beach Field Naturalists, awarded him with a life membership. I'm very, very happy that OFO has given the award to Clive. I think there are very few people around who deserve it more. All the effort he put in, and bird finding guides, there isn't a lot of things for those. But like Gerry said, for years and years, people have driven around with those in their cars. Just the amount of money it saved you in gas on wrong turns was probably worth the effort put in. So, as Gerry said, we went in late April to give the award to Clive. And at the time, I brought my camera and I recorded a little bit of a thank you from Clive and Gerry presenting him with the award. So just have to find it here. So we have virtual Clive. Of course, somebody suggested to me earlier we should have Skyped him, and that probably would have worked even better.
Clive, it's a pleasure to present to you on behalf of Ontario Field Ornithologists the Distinguished Ornithologist Award for this year.
Thank you very much.
It's a privilege to present you with a lifetime membership in OFO.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful honor that OFO is giving me. I really deeply appreciate it. It was totally unexpected, something which is not something that anybody can expect, really. And I'm just very, very grateful for this kind of generosity. Thank everybody very, very much.
So I'll just remind everyone that the book is going around. Please make sure to sign it, because I will be bringing that and presenting it to Clive as well. Thanks very much.